Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Monday to Friday on CGTN. We begin our program today in Beijing, where the second session of the 13th National People's Congress concluded its 10-day meeting on Friday morning. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang met the press soon after the NPC session concluded. Before we ask our panelists about the implications of the policies this time, take a look at this.
It's official. China's annual political meetings, the two sessions, have wrapped up. At the closing session, deputies approved the government work report, a new foreign investment law, an economic and social development plan, and the annual budget, among others. The foreign investment law was approved after days of deliberation. It has attracted global attention since it gives foreign investors unprecedented access to the Chinese market. This is a milestone in the nation's opening up journey. The work report also stresses the pursuit of higher quality development. The economic growth target has decreased from 6.5% to 6%, while the tax cut for private enterprises is worth 2 trillion yuan. When Premier Li Keqiang took questions from the media, China's economy and its foreign relations dominated the marathon Q&A session. He said despite a slowdown, the country was determined not to use large-scale quantitative easing to prop it up. Instead, the government would look to revitalize the market through high-quality development and measures aimed at boosting consumption.
Tax and fee cuts means government's income will fall, but the growth of fiscal spending will be in line with the GDP growth this year, especially to ensure spending on key areas such as people's livelihood.
The Premier touched upon the importance of creating more jobs, as this would drive social prosperity. On China-U.S. relations, Li said he was quite optimistic that both sides could resolve their current impasse.
For more on the outcome of the two sessions and Premier Li Keqiang's news conference, in Chicago we have Yang Dali, Professor of Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome, sir. In Houston, we have Dan Slane, ex-commissioner for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review. What a pleasure to see you once again. And joining us in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean at the Center of International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome to the three of you. I want to start with you, Professor Liu, in Beijing. Challenges and opportunities. The challenges seems to be having a bigger weight this time. How much solutions are we really seeing as a result of two sessions this time?
Well, as Premier Li put it, the biggest challenge is to stall the development. So therefore, to face such challenges, one is to further open Chinese door for global participation. And the other is to continue to deepen Chinese reform, particularly that is really catered to the deregulation, to reduce the burden on companies, and also to liberalize the market so that we are able to improve the investment climate and to sustain Chinese economic growth.
Right. To you, Professor Yang, you are observing this from the U.S., from the political science perspective. How do you see, in a way, going back to the principles? Premier Li, this time at the press conference, talked about several things. For example, the opening up policy is the fundamental state policy of China. For example, the role of a government is not to give orders to the market, but rather have the market in mind when drawing policies. A lot of the interesting takeaways is this time. Professor Yang?
Well, I think he did a great job in really showing, giving greater confidence to the markets in a way that's reflected also in the securities markets overnight. Not only was he emphasizing the importance of stabilizing growth by cutting taxes, reducing burdens, and streamlining government, but he also actually sent a very powerful signal when he said that if the economy does stall, the government actually does have the tools to do more because there is some leeway, whether it's in terms of the reserve ratios or in terms of the deficit. So in that sense, actually, he was really managing truly to sort of in terms of trying to address issues from both the hard side and also from the soft side in terms of economic management.
Mr. Slaying, from your perspective, I mean, before the two sessions, you heard quite some negative coverage about China's economy if you look at the so-called headlines in some of the media coverage. However, if you look at the numbers, though, it's not bad at all, to be frank, actually. And also, if you talk about the reserve ratio, as well as the deficit only 0.3% is much, much, much below the 3%, which is the dangerous barometer there. So, Mr. Slaying, you know, from a real economic perspective and trade, how do you see the challenges and opportunities China is facing right now?
Yeah, one of the things that the White House is asking for is for the Chinese to open up their markets to American goods. And the Premier is saying that. So I think that's a real positive sign. The other thing that they have to do is increase consumerism. And he's doing that as well. And he's got to get away from an export-dominated economy. So I think he's certainly going down the right road.
Well, it's not just what the White House has asked, isn't it, Professor Yang? It is also what China, with its own momentum, has to reform and also has to do its own things well. You heard that phrase repeatedly this time at the annual two sessions, Professor Yang.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it is really related to the structural changes within the economy, whether it's demographics. In fact, the Premier spent quite a bit of time talking about services, especially for seniors, but also services for children, in the sense, really, the fact that there are just not enough facilities to take care of the elderly, whose numbers are growing rapidly. So in that sense, as the population ages, also the economy tends to draw down the savings and so on, and become less actually export-oriented.
Professor Liu, about that, it's not just how businesses will be treated, whether it's Chinese businesses, reduction of fees and taxes, 2 trillion yuan this time, and the government organization, also state-owned enterprises likely to provide that part of the money, according to the Chinese Premier. But also, how is China going to motivate its internal market in a way? Welfare issue, as Professor Yang beautifully illustrated, is a big part of it. And this time, the Premier is talking about providing help, support to all the market incentives, even within the community itself, for the elderly and also for the early child education.
Well, we have been implementing the supply-side reform for the last several years, and a certain impact has already been felt in a positive way.
Right.
But in the meantime, supply-side reform will have to look at the consumption side. So with the demographic changes and with the entire supply chain is moving to the higher end of the stream. So therefore, to build equilibrium between supply and consumption is very critical for policymakers, and that can also give much of the positive climate for businesses to function and for consumers really benefit from this type of reform.
It's about confidence, isn't it? China is not lack of money. It's not lack of liquidity. I mean, it's just a matter of fact, but rather how investors going to be looking at the market, both domestic and international, and also whether consumers are really going to consume, and to what extent they're going to consume, isn't it, Professor?
Yeah, I think a key word is predictability. So if investors are able to predict
in the right direction.
That's right, are able to predict that they are going to earn a reasonable return on the investment on a longer period of time, they will not really go there to gamble. And on the consumption side, I do not think you really need to stimulate them. But rather, if they really have steady income, have a newer job opportunities, they are able to decide what to buy and how to allocate resources for a longer period of time.
That's right.
So therefore, confidence, as you said, is really based on predictable environment. The government is there to provide them.
And the realities on the ground, of course.
Of course.
Mr. Slane, of course you're observing this from afar, but you know, job, that's a key word everywhere in the two sessions this time as well. The Chinese government is talking about creating 13 million jobs 1 year alone. Of course, Washington talk about jobs too, but not of the same scale. So this is an interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, you have the restructuring of economy, of course, it slows down. It's just a natural process. But on the other hand, you also got the external pressure coming from the United States and others about the trade and the future. So how is China going to create those 13 million jobs while the others are asking, well, you should create more jobs for us?
I think the opportunity for China is in the service industry. That's where they're going to create the 13 million jobs. You know, for example, the whole area of taking care of older people in China is in a revolution. I mean, now homes are being built, and there's an enormous healthcare industry that's going to take up a lot of jobs. So the whole focus, I think, in terms of creating those, is going to be in the service sector.
All right. Of course, that will be one of the solutions, but how to translate that theory into realities, there is a very complicated process probably one have to bear in mind. Another thing, Professor Yang, is about U.S.-China relations, and how is that having an impact on China's overall approach to the rest of the world? You heard about issues China-U.S., China-Europe, and China's neighboring countries, including Japan, and China's overall approach to international investors as well. So, Professor Yang, to you, can you name it? What exactly is the approach that Beijing is thinking about right now, given the information you have collected over the past 2 weeks during the two sessions?
Well, I think this is one of the most controversial areas. It's not just about Beijing or Washington, because Washington also, in the process of negotiating with China, is keeping its allies, including the Europeans, at bay in terms of the terms being discussed and so on. But under WTO rules, of course, there is the issue of non-discrimination. So how this issue is going to be resolved later on if the two sides do decide on a deal and find out, reach the terms for agreement, how those terms are going to apply to other countries, that will be a huge issue that I don't think actually has been worked out yet. At this point, the two sides are so focused on bargaining with each other that they are not paying attention to what's going on actually in Europe or in the rest of Asia to some extent. But the Premier, however, did emphasize the reaching out to, however, to Northeast Asia, to Japan and South Korea in particular. So in that sense, there is something important. I think actually China will continue to approach this multilaterally in the rest of Asia and also through the comprehensive partnership and so on.
Mr. Slane, while the negotiations going on, the Chinese Premier at the annual press conference talked about the impossible and unrealistic to decouple the two economies. Now, we know some of those in Washington are already shouting out that slogan, decouple from China. But, you know, really, is that the reality that people can really look at? And whether politics is going to serve the real interest of the two countries?
No, I don't think it's way too late to decouple. It's just too cemented, and so that's not going to happen. I think that Washington wants the Chinese to open up their markets more, and the Premier is saying that he's going to do that. And I think Washington wants the Chinese to help them with the trade deficit. And so that, I think those two things are probably being discussed at the moment.
Yeah, but Mr. Slane, as you may know, the trade deficit since President Trump coming into power only increased rather than decreased, given the fact that it is doing so-called bilateral negotiations and taking up issues with all the countries and also slashing tariffs on many of its trading partners. But the deficit is only going up rather than going down. So very interesting situation, isn't it? Can Washington blame the others? Can Beijing really bring down the number for Washington?
Well, they can, they can help. That's the biggest deficit. The country with the biggest impact is China. So, they could be helpful, and he's got to deal with Europe as well. So you're right, and he's reformed NAFTA, and he's reformed the Korean trade agreement, all to help the deficit situation. So I think I understand it's gone up, but I think there's a certain point where he can start to reduce it.
Well, at least he believes so. Professor Liu, to you, how do you see that map? I mean, if you look at China's overall situation interacting with the rest of the world, you got negotiations going on over there in North America, and you got China and the EU with the Premier talking about strategic and long-term vision, and the leaders going to meet early April. You've also got China-Japan at the establishment of relations, quite an anniversary this year, and the G20, in which the Chinese President, Mr. Xi Jinping, going to go there, and certainly there will be some kinds of multilateral and probably even bilateral occasions. You also got China and Russia, a big power relationship going on there, 100 billion yuan, dollars rather, that has been created for bilateral trade. Earlier it was about trade and not catching up with politics, but now it is. So there seems to be a very diversified things going on all at the same time. To you, Professor Liu, Professor of Economics, how do you see this?
Well, China, as we are growing our size, definitely we're going to have a lot of bumpy road along the global path. As Premier Li put it, the more complicated the global issue, the more confident China will be in walking down its own path. He said, as long as we are doing the right homework at home, we are not really afraid of all the challenges. But in the meantime, China will keep an open mind and open policy towards the whole world and fully defend the multilateral trading system. So he identified that it is not really the globalization that bears the blame, but it's really some countries that responded in a wrong way to globalization. That really bears the blame. Right. I think he's really also bringing up a wake-up call to many policymakers around the world as how they can really embrace the globalization in a positive way that can benefit their own people and the world.
Mr. Slane, the WTO reform is coming up on the agenda later this year. You see different parties put forward their own versions of so-called suggestions and their bottom line. How do you see with what's going on recently with China's annual political season in that discussion between China and the U.S., for example?
Well, yeah, I think the election of Trump indicated to a lot of politicians that they have neglected the working class in the center part of the United States who were so affected negatively by globalization. So they're trying to protect that segment of the population, and both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, are trying to focus on the what we call the Rust Belt areas of the United States who have been so negatively impacted by globalization. So that's what's going on here politically.
We'll see how that is played out on
and
the
that's going to impact on...
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, that's what's going to impact a lot on trade with China.
Sure, it will, and it does already, right? Before we go, final question. During the annual press conference, Professor Liu, the Chinese Premier was being asked about Huawei and whether China is asking its companies to spy on the other countries, whether it's businesses or state operations. So, Professor Liu, the Chinese Premier said out and loud and clear, no, not in the past, not present, not in the future. So how will that be able to change some of the rhetorics or misconceptions as Chinese sees it that's going on around in some of the coverages and people's minds in different parts of the world?
Well, the promises and pledges are very important, but I think more importantly is that we have to believe that facts speaks louder than words. If they really identify someone is stealing the technology or misusing their technical power, then find it and bring them to the court. If not, better shut up.
Okay, Professor Yang, you have different view or similar?
I have no comment on this issue at this moment.
Well, we see a lot of discussions about what has been done, what has not, and what countries will do. Of course, as all of you said, the gentlemen, before we wrap it up, actions speak louder than words, and we'll see how things would evolve from here. For now, we want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, for joining us for this round of discussion and put forward your insights from your own perspectives. Professor Yang Da Li, Mr. Dan Sling, and Professor Liu Baocheng. Thank you so much for joining us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Mass shootings strike 2 Christchurch mosques. Why has terrorism come to New Zealand?